In the rural United States, nearly 1 in 3 households survives on invisible work, labor that never appears on a formal ledger. This is the story of one such transaction, beginning with a woman, a broken fence, and a silent bargain for her dignity. Her name is Ilara Vance, and for 3 days she has walked the drought-stricken backroads of Jasper County, surviving on the bitter calculus of pride. The rancher is Marcus Thorne, a man who values solitude and a well-kept boundary. What happens next isn't about charity. It's about the unspoken economy of respect, and the moment a simple act of labor becomes a fuse for something far more dangerous. Jasper County had been dying by inches for 18 months. The drought wasn't just weather, it was an economic solvent, dissolving futures, partnerships, and the last threads of the social contract. For Ilara Vance, it dissolved everything but her hands and her will. She had been the office manager at the now-shuttered grain co-op in Millerton. When the bank called in the loan and the doors were chained, she was part of the 38.2% of rural households pushed into the informal economy overnight. Her savings lasted 4 months. Her rent was 2 months overdue when her landlord, a man facing his own foreclosure, left a $50 bill and an eviction notice on her kitchen table. The money was for the bus, he'd said, anywhere but here. She didn't take the bus. She took her late father's leather tool belt, the one he'd worn building houses, and she started walking south along County Road 9. The calculus was simple, born of the research on dignity that shows objectification drives people away from help. She would work, not ask. She would trade labor for sustenance on the terms of the old moral economy, where a day's work still had inherent value, even when the formal market said it didn't. For 3 days she walked, sleeping in the lee of drainage culverts, drinking from the spare, tepid streams that still trickled in the deepest gullies. Her destination was not a place, but a concept, a boundary in need of maintenance, a fence line, a split rail or barbed wire declaration of ownership that, in a drought, became a vulnerability. A rancher with a broken fence was a rancher who might accept an unspoken bargain. She found it on the 4th morning, the Thorne Ranch. The main house was a low-slung cabin of weathered timber set back against a rocky rise, with a barn and a corral that held only dust. The fence was a 3-rail wooden boundary separating the ranch's scrubland from the county road. A section of about 20 feet had been knocked flat, the rails splintered, the posts leaning at defeated angles. It was recent damage, likely from a panicked deer or a reckless driver in the night. It was also, for Ilara, a ledger, an opportunity to make a deposit in the economy of respect. She approached from the road, her posture straight, her tool belt prominent. She did not look toward the house. She went directly to the broken section, knelt in the dry grass and began her assessment. She ran her hands along the splintered wood, testing the integrity of the posts that remained. She was not performing. This was the competence that reciprocal altruism requires, the signal that she had something of value to offer, that this was not a plea but a potential exchange. Inside the cabin, Marcus Thorne saw her the moment she crested the gentle rise from the road. He was at the kitchen window, a tin cup of coffee grown cold in his hand. He was 36, and the ranch was a legacy he was failing to hold together. 200 acres of what had been, in his father's time, viable grazing land. Now it was brittle grass and dust. The bank had sent the second notice last week. The phrase water rights acquisition was buried in the legalese, but he knew what it meant. The Consolidated Land and Water Corporation was buying up everything along this valley, and his ranch was the last holdout. They wanted the aquifer beneath his land, and they were using the drought as a lever. He watched the woman for a full minute, his mind cycling through possibilities. A scout from Consolidated, a desperate neighbor. Her clothes were worn but clean, her dark hair in a practical braid. The tool belt looked used, not a prop. He saw her examine the break with a critical, knowledgeable eye. Then she stood, retrieved a hammer and a pry bar from the leather pouch at her hip, and set to work. She worked with a focused, relentless economy of motion. She pried nails, sorted salvageable wood from firewood, and began the methodical process of realigning the main posts. The morning sun climbed and sweat darkened the back of her beige blouse. She did not pause. She did not look toward the house. Marcus did not move from the window. This is where the psychology becomes critical. Studies of reciprocal altruism show that for cooperation to initiate with a stranger, the help must be visible and the cost must be clear. Ilara was demonstrating both. She was also, perhaps unconsciously, avoiding the dynamic that research on homelessness pinpoints as most destructive, the infantilizing gaze of charity. She was not waiting for permission or handout. She was creating a fact on the ground. Marcus understood fences. He understood the language of boundaries and what it meant when someone else repaired yours without a word. In the rural moral economy, this was a profound gesture. It could be a threat, a claim, or an offer. He watched her hands, the sure way she swung the hammer, the calluses visible even from this distance. This was not her first day of hard labor. By noon, she had one new rail fitted and pinned. The sun was brutal, a hammer of heat on the open land. She took a break, sitting on a surviving fence post and drinking from a small canteen. Only then did she allow herself a single, fleeting glance toward the cabin. She did not see him in the window. He had stepped back into the shadows. Marcus turned from the window. His kitchen was sparse. A wood stove, a table, 2 chairs. The silence of the place was a presence. He looked at the empty chair across from his, and for the first time in a long time, the emptiness felt like an accusation. The unspoken offer on his fence line demanded an unspoken response. But the rules of this game were delicate. To approach her now could reframe her labor as a performance for his benefit, stripping it of its autonomous dignity. To ignore it entirely would be a rejection of the reciprocal impulse that binds communities, especially in crisis. He made a decision. He moved to his icebox, a genuine antique he kept cold with block ice from town, and pulled out the ingredients he'd been saving: a piece of salt-cured ham, the last of the summer potatoes from his failed garden, 2 eggs from the few hens that survived. He built a fire in the stove's belly and began to cook. The act was deliberate, almost ceremonial. He was not preparing his own lunch. He was setting a table for 2. The smell of frying ham and potatoes eventually drifted on the hot, still air. Ilara, driving a final nail into a rail, paused. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring slightly. The scent was unmistakable, and it was a message as clear as any shouted invitation. Her stomach clenched, but her hands kept working. She finished securing the rail, then moved to the next broken section. Inside, Marcus laid out 2 plates. He set 2 forks, 2 knives. He filled 2 glasses with water from his cistern. Then he returned to the window. The table was set behind him, a silent promise in the dim cabin. He watched her work, and he saw the precise moment her body recognized the precipice she was on. The repair was nearly complete. The unspoken bargain was about to come due. Would he honor it? She drove the last nail, then stepped back to survey her work. The fence stood whole again, a continuous line against the bleached landscape. She wiped her hands on her skirt, collected her tools, and finally turned fully to face the cabin. She stood there in the late afternoon light, a figure of exhausted resolve, waiting for the next move in this silent negotiation. Marcus met her gaze through the glass. He gave a single slow nod. Then he turned and gestured toward the table set for 2. But as he did, the sound of an engine, rough and grinding, cut through the quiet. A dust cloud appeared on the long driveway. A familiar, hateful truck, black, with the green triangle logo of Consolidated Land and Water on the door. It was Brad Keller, the corporation's local agent, and he was early for his weekly check-in, the polite term for his pressure campaign. Marcus's eyes snapped from the truck back to Ilara, standing exposed by the repaired fence. Keller's arrival changed everything. The private, fragile economy of respect was about to be crashed by the brutal economics of extraction. Ilara was no longer just a woman who'd fixed a fence. She was a witness, and Consolidated Land and Water made a habit of removing problems. Marcus's hand, still pointing toward the set table, now felt like he was pointing her toward a trap. The truck rolled closer, and the real cost of his silent dinner invitation was about to come due. Marcus Thorne moved before the truck had fully stopped, crossing his porch in 3 long strides. The calculus of threat had just been rewritten. The woman at the fence was no longer just a participant in a silent exchange. She was a liability in a very visible war. Inside, now. His voice was a low command, not shouted but carrying across the yard with a force that brooked no argument. Alara Vance didn't hesitate. The primal language of urgency overrode the delicate dance of their earlier negotiation. She grabbed her tool belt and crossed the open ground, her work boots kicking up little puffs of dust. She was through the cabin door just as the black truck's engine died with a rough cough. Brad Keller stepped out, smoothing his polyester shirt over a paunch that spoke of diner meals and long drives. His smile was a professional tool, worn and practiced. "Marcus, saw you had some help out here." His eyes tracked Alara's disappearance into the cabin's dim interior. "New hired hand." "Passing through," Marcus said, positioning himself on the porch step, a physical barrier. "Needed a meal, fixed a fence." Keller's smile didn't falter, but it cooled by several degrees. "Is that right? Lot of folks passing through these days. Lot of folks looking for a meal." He hooked his thumbs in his belt loops, a gesture of folksy authority. "You know, our community outreach folks at Consolidated have a whole program for the economically displaced. Keeps things orderly. You should have sent her our way." This was the institutional pressure made flesh. Consolidated didn't just buy land. It sought to manage the human fallout, to absorb and redirect desperation into channels it controlled. An orderly solution that removed unpredictable elements like a woman trading labor for food on her own terms. "I'll keep that in mind," Marcus said, his voice flat. Keller nodded toward the repaired fence section. "Good work. Sturdy. Reminds me, the easement survey team will be out tomorrow. Final verification on the boundary lines for the pipeline corridor." He let the words hang. The pipeline corridor was the legal fiction Consolidated used to claim eminent domain over a swath of land that included the entire northern edge of Marcus's property, and crucially, the primary access to the aquifer's recharge zone. "You're early," Marcus said. "The survey was supposed to be next week." "Timelines moved up. Progress waits for no man, Marcus." Keller's gaze drifted back to the cabin door. "A man alone out here, though, can make mistakes, get sentimental about broken things that just need clearing away." The threat was veiled but clear. The woman was a complication, and Marcus's protection of her was a weakness to be exploited. Inside, Alara stood with her back against the rough-hewn wall just out of sight of the doorway. She heard every word. The term economically displaced landed like a slap. It was the formal, sanitized label for the 3 days of walking, the hollow hunger, the choice to sleep in a ditch. It was the language of the system that had discarded her, now offering to manage her decline. Her hands, still gritty from fence work, curled into fists. Marcus didn't give Keller an opening. "The survey needs 48 hours written notice. Per county statute, you don't have it. Come back when you do." For the first time, Keller's smile vanished. The folksy pretense dropped, revealing the hard transactional core beneath. Statutes can be fast-tracked, with the right county supervisor appreciating the economic benefits. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Thorne. The offer for your land is still on the table. It's more than fair for dust and debt." "The answer is still no." Keller looked at him for a long, silent moment. Then he shrugged, the smile reappearing, thinner now. "Suit yourself. We'll get our paperwork in order. You have a good day now." He tipped an imaginary hat, climbed back into his truck, and reversed down the driveway in a cloud of ochre dust. The silence he left behind was brittle. Marcus stood on the porch until the dust settled, then turned and entered the cabin. Alara hadn't moved. The set table with its 2 plates sat between them, a poignant relic of a different, simpler tension. "Who was that?" Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, the adrenaline of being hunted, even if the hunter wore a smile. "The local face of my bankruptcy," Marcus said, moving to the window to watch the empty road. "Consolidated land and water. They don't just want to buy me out. They need me to sell. My land sits on the only substantial aquifer for 20 miles that they don't control. My grandfather's deed has the oldest water rights in the valley. Without them, their entire development model for this county collapses. Ilara absorbed this. The personal crisis of a single rancher expanded into a systemic one. And the fence. The easement they want runs right along it. A pipeline corridor. If they get the county to approve the eminent domain claim, they can tear down anything on that path, including my wellhead. A broken fence is a small problem. A missing fence because the law says it can't be there is a permanent one. He finally turned from the window to look at her. You fixed a symbol of something they're trying to erase. That makes you interesting to them. And interesting is not a safe thing to be. Ilara moved away from the wall, her eyes scanning the room, the sparse furniture, the bank notices stacked on a side table, the single bookshelf. A life under siege. The meal, she said, gesturing to the table. Was this the reciprocity, or pity before you send me on my way? Marcus exhaled, a sound of frustration. It wasn't pity. You know what it was. You initiated the exchange. I was acknowledging it. That's how this is supposed to work. He echoed the research without knowing it, the fundamental rule of reciprocal altruism. A benefit given creates an expectation of a future return, building social bonds. But Keller changed the equation. Now if you walk down that road, he'll find you. He'll offer you $100 to tell him anything you might have heard me say. Or he'll just have one of his community outreach people pick you up, and you'll disappear into their system. Her chin lifted. I'm not part of your war. You are now. You mended a fence on the battlefield. That makes you a combatant in their eyes. He walked to the table and pulled out a chair. Sit. The food's cold, but it's still food. We need to talk about how you walk away from this without walking into something worse. Reluctantly, she sat. He took the chair opposite. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. The ham was salty, the potatoes hearty. It was the first real meal she'd had in days, and the simple act of eating together in the quiet cabin created a fragile, temporary truce. Why are you holding out? She asked finally, pushing her plate aside. If the offer is fair and you're drowning anyway, why? Marcus leaned back, his eyes distant. My father died thinking he'd failed this land because he couldn't make it rain. I'm going to fail it because I can't fight a corporation. But there's a difference. He was beaten by nature. I'll be beaten by men who see a map, not a home. If I sell, they'll pump the aquifer dry in 10 years. The whole valley turns to dust. Everything my family worked for becomes a footnote in a water transfer report. I can't stop them, but I can make the footnote expensive. It was a stance of pure defiance, one that the research on dignity would recognize as a last stand to preserve self-worth in the face of systemic annihilation. Ilara understood it on a cellular level. It was the same impulse that made her fix a fence instead of hold out a hand. I used to process the environmental impact surveys, she said quietly, not looking at him. At the co-op, before it closed, farmers would submit them for loan extensions. I saw Consolidated's name on a lot of the counter surveys. Their hydrology reports were creative. They consistently overestimated recharge rates and underestimated drawdown by a factor of 2, sometimes 3. It's how they get permits. Marcus went very still. This was the pivot. The random, dignified drifter was not random at all. She carried specific, dangerous knowledge. You know this for a fact. I processed the paperwork. I saw the original county assessments next to Consolidated's revisions. The numbers didn't match. I asked my manager about the discrepancy once. She paused, the memory tightening her features. He told me to file the paperwork and be grateful I had a job to lose. 2 weeks later, the co-op's line of credit was mysteriously withdrawn. We closed 6 months after that. So her unemployment wasn't just a symptom of the drought. It was a collateral casualty of Consolidated strategy. They hadn't just made her economically displaced. They had engineered the displacement to silence a potential whistleblower. The air in the cabin changed. The dynamic shifted from protector and protected to potential allies with a common enemy. Marcus studied her, the intelligence in her eyes, the precision with which she described the data fraud. "If you were to testify to that," he said slowly, "before the County Planning Commission, it could derail their easement application. They need those permits." Ilara shook her head, a sharp, defensive motion. "No, that's not my fight. I did my part. I kept my head down. I lost anyway. Now I just need to get to my sister's place in Cedar Fork, find some work, and survive. I'm not signing up for a crusade." "It's not a crusade. It's a correction, and you're already in it." Marcus stood and went to the side table, shuffling through the papers. He pulled out a formal-looking letter with the county seal. "Keller moved the survey up because the Planning Commission hearing is in 7 days. They're rushing the process before anyone can organize opposition. If they get that easement, my fight is over, and your testimony is the only thing that puts their own fraudulent documents into the public record." He held the letter out to her. It was a notice of public hearing regarding the Consolidated Valley Water Infrastructure Project, Section 7A, Thorn Parcel. Ilara didn't take it. "You don't understand. They have lawyers. They have the county supervisor in their pocket. They'll tear me apart. They'll say I'm a disgruntled former employee fabricating stories. They'll bury me." "Probably," Marcus admitted, not softening the truth. "But they'll have to do it in a public hearing on the record. And while they're busy burying you, they can't also be fast-tracking their survey. It buys time, for me, for the other holdouts down the valley." He put the letter on the table between them. "You talked about the economy of respect. This is the other side of that coin. It's the economy of responsibility. Sometimes the debt you incur isn't for a meal. It's for being the only one who knows the truth." The weight of his request settled on her. The fragile autonomy she'd carved out with her tool belt was being replaced with a terrifying collective obligation. She looked at her hands, the raw knuckles, the dirt under her nails. Hands that could mend a fence. Could they also help tear down a lie? Before she could answer, a new sound cut through the afternoon. Not a truck, but the crunch of gravel under multiple boots, approaching from the direction of the barn. Marcus was at the window in an instant. 3 men, dressed in work clothes but moving with a coordinated purpose, were fanning out across his yard. One carried a long metal case. Another had a tripod. The third was on a radio. "The survey team," Marcus whispered, anger sharpening his voice. "He didn't come back with paperwork. He just sent them. They're starting without permission." Ilara joined him at the window. The men ignored the house completely, setting up their equipment on the repaired fence line. One man unlatched the case and pulled out a high-precision GPS unit, the kind used for legal boundary demarcation. They were acting as if the permission was a formality they could dispense with. "This is illegal," Marcus said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Illegality was a speed bump for an entity like Consolidated, something to be handled later by lawyers and fines that were just a cost of doing business. The man with the radio spoke into it, then pointed toward the cabin. A moment later, Keller's truck reappeared, parking on the county road this time. Keller got out, leaned against the hood and crossed his arms, watching, a supervisor observing his crew. Marcus's hand balled into a fist on the windowsill. The blatant violation was a message. Your boundaries, legal or physical, are irrelevant. We draw the lines now. Ilara watched the surveyor's transit scope swing toward the house, the lens glinting in the sun like a cold, mechanical eye. They were not just mapping the land. They were asserting dominion over it, and by extension, over the people on it. Her earlier fear of testifying melted into a different, hotter emotion, a righteous fury at the sheer, arrogant violation. She turned from the window and looked at Marcus. "Do you have any of those old county hydrology reports, the ones they contradicted?" Marcus blinked, pulled from his rage. "In the barn. My father kept every piece of paper related to this land, boxes of it." "Get them," Ilara said, her voice now stripped of hesitation. "Every map, every survey, every water test from before Consolidated showed up. If they're going to redraw the lines today, we need to show everyone the lines they already erased. She wasn't agreeing to testify yet, but she was taking a step. She was moving from a bystander to an archivist, gathering the weapons at hand. Marcus saw the shift in her, the rekindling of the competent, analytical person she'd been before the co-op died. It was the same competence she'd used to fix the fence, now directed at a far more complex repair job. He nodded, a spark of grim hope in his eyes. The barn this way. They moved toward the back door of the cabin, which led to a small covered walkway toward the barn. But as Marcus opened the door, the surveyor with the radio called out, his voice amplified and crisp across the yard. "Mr. Thorne, we're conducting a county-sanctioned land survey. You are required by law not to interfere. Please remain in your residence." Marcus froze. The command was a trap. If he obeyed, he was acquiescing to their authority on his property. If he disobeyed, he gave them a pretext, interfering with a legal survey, which Keller could use to call the sheriff. Alara peered past him. The three men had stopped their work. All eyes were on the back of the cabin. Keller was still leaning on his truck, but he was watching intently, a small smile on his face. He'd orchestrated this confrontation perfectly. "They're boxing you in," Alara murmured. "If you step out, you're the aggressor. If you stay in, you're surrendering." Marcus's jaw worked. He looked at the dusty path to the barn, a distance of maybe 30 yards. It might as well have been a mile. The survey team stood between him and his own history, his own evidence. Then Alara did something unexpected. She stepped past him, out into the open doorway, shielding her eyes from the sun. She didn't address the surveyors. She called out, her voice clear and carrying, aimed at Keller on the road. "Mr. Keller, your crew is trespassing. They don't have the required notice posted. I know the statute, Section 12-2 of the County Land Use Code. You want to conduct this legally, you come back with the sheriff and the paperwork." Silence fell. The surveyors looked at each other, uncertain. Keller straightened up, his smile gone. He hadn't expected a lecture on county code from the hired hand. Marcus stared at Alara. She had just done two things. First, she had publicly aligned herself with him, declaring herself a witness to the trespass. Second, and more importantly, she had reframed the conflict. It was no longer Marcus Thorne versus the survey crew. It was a question of legal procedure, and she had just demonstrated she knew the procedure better than they did. Keller recovered quickly. He strode from the road into the yard, his face a mask of placid authority. "Ma'am, this is a matter for the landowner and the county. I suggest you go back inside." "I suggest you read your own regulations," Alara fired back, not moving from the doorway. "No survey work may commence within 50 feet of a domicile without written permission from the occupant. That transit scope is pointed at the kitchen window. That's a violation. I'm an occupant." She was bluffing. She wasn't an occupant, she was a guest. But she delivered it with such conviction that the surveyor with the tripod instinctively took a step back. Keller's eyes narrowed. He was recalculating. This woman was not just desperate, she was informed and she was stubborn. A dangerous combination. His gaze shifted to Marcus, still in the shadow of the doorway. "Marcus, call off your friend. This doesn't need to get ugly." But the power dynamic had subtly shifted. Alara had created a stalemate based on rules, and in that moment, rules were the only thing preventing a physical confrontation. Marcus seized the opening. "I think you should all head back to the county office," Marcus said, his voice calm now. "Get your notices in order. We'll be here, and we'll be filing a formal complaint of trespass with the sheriff's office this afternoon. You can explain your timeline to him." It was a checkmate move. If Keller pressed on, he risked actual legal charges, not just procedural delays. The cost of bullying had just gone up. Keller looked from Marcus to Alara, his expression unreadable. The afternoon heat shimmered between them. Finally, he gave a curt nod to his crew. "Pack it up." The surveyors began, quickly and quietly to dismantle their equipment. The confrontation was over for now. But as Keller turned to walk back to his truck, he paused and looked directly at Alara. "You're good with details, I see. That's a valuable skill. Consolidated is always looking for competent people for our documentation teams. The pay is steady. The work is indoors. It was an offer and a threat. Join us or be crushed by us." Alara met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence was her answer. Keller got in his truck and drove away, his crew following in a separate vehicle. The yard was empty again, but the peace was gone, replaced by a buzzing, electric tension. Marcus let out a long breath. "Thank you." Alara's shoulders slumped slightly, the adrenaline draining away. "Don't. I just bought us an afternoon. He'll be back with the sheriff and every piece of paper he needs, and he'll remember me." She was right. The temporary victory had permanently escalated the conflict. She was now a named player in the game, a thorn in Consolidated's side. The path to Cedar Fork and anonymity had just been closed off. "We need those documents now more than ever," Marcus said, "and we need to get them somewhere safe. Keller might not bother with paperwork next time. He might just send someone to make the barn and all its contents disappear." The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows from the repaired fence across the dusty yard. The simple, dignified transaction of labor for food had metastasized into a conspiracy to hide evidence from a powerful corporation. The two of them stood on the threshold, the safe interior of the cabin behind them, the vulnerable barn ahead. Every box of papers they carried from that barn would be an act of defiance and a beacon for retribution. The clock was ticking, and Keller's final, calculating glance at Alara promised that the next move would not be about procedure. It would be about removal. They worked for 2 hours in the dusty, suffocating heat of the barn, pulling cardboard boxes from beneath old horse blankets and stacked hay bales. It was in the third box, marked Correspondence 1998-2002, that Alara found the first thread of a different story entirely. One that connected her past to Marcus's present in a way that made her blood run cold. It was a carbon copy letter, the kind produced by a typewriter and a sheet of carbon paper. The letterhead was from the Jasper County Agricultural Cooperative. The date was October 12, 2001. The recipient was Samuel Thorne, Marcus's father. The subject line read, "Preliminary Hydrologic Assessment for Parcel 7A Thorne." And at the bottom, in the prepared by line, was a signature she knew as well as her own, Robert Vance, her father. Her hands began to shake. She had known her father worked at the co-op before his accident, but as a junior accountant. She never knew he was involved in field assessments. She read the letter. It was a standard cover letter for a technical report, but one phrase leapt out. Initial findings suggest aquifer recharge rates are highly dependent on undisturbed riparian zones along the northern parcel boundary. Any development that disrupts these zones risks irreversible drawdown. She looked up, the paper trembling in her hand. "Marcus, my father wrote this." Marcus, who was shoulder-deep in a trunk of maps, turned. He saw her face and came over. He took the letter, read it, and his expression shifted from curiosity to dawning horror. "This is the original assessment. The one Consolidated's reports contradicted. They didn't just falsify data, they had to discredit the source." He looked at her. "Your father." Alara's mind raced, connecting shattered pieces of her own history. Her father's accident in 2003, a fall from a grain silo at the co-op that left him with a traumatic brain injury, ending his career. He became withdrawn, depressed, a shell of the man she knew. He never spoke about work. The official report called it a tragic mishap. The co-op settled quickly, quietly, with a non-disclosure agreement. Her family never questioned it. They needed the money for his care. "What if it wasn't an accident?" she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "What if he saw something? What if he was going to speak up about these reports?" Marcus was already moving, pulling more boxes. "Find the report this letter is talking about. The full assessment. It has to be here. My father kept everything." They tore through the remaining boxes with frantic energy. The barn became a hurricane of paper and dust, and then in a flat document case at the bottom of an old milking stall, they found it, a bound report over 100 pages thick, comprehensive hydrologic survey of the northern Jasper Valley aquifer system, prepared for the Jasper County Agricultural Cooperative. Lead author, Robert Vance. Date, November 2001. Alara opened it with reverent, terrified hands. The pages were dense with data, maps, cross-sections of the underground water table. It was a masterpiece of careful, conservative science. And on page 87 in the conclusions, a paragraph was circled in faded red pencil. Based on modeled extraction rates, any industrial-scale withdrawal exceeding 50,000 gallons per day from the primary recharge zone, Parcel 7A, will induce aquifer collapse within a 10-year period, rendering the entire northern valley unsuitable for agriculture or sustained human habitation. Marcus read over her shoulder. Consolidated's permit application is for 200,000 gallons per day. They're asking to pump 4 times the collapse threshold. But they said the aquifer was robust, that it could handle it, Alara said, her voice hollow. They lied, and your father had the proof. This report would have sunk their entire project 20 years ago. Marcus's face was grim. So they made sure it never saw the light of day, and they made sure Robert Vance never spoke again. The personal and the systemic collided with devastating force. Alara's family tragedy wasn't just bad luck, it was a strategic silencing. Her own unemployment wasn't just economic shift, it was the final mopping up operation. Consolidated hadn't just stolen her father's voice and her job, they had stolen her understanding of her own life. She sat back on her heels, the weight of it crushing. The dignified, autonomous work of mending a fence had led her directly to the site of her family's original wound. This wasn't just about testifying anymore. This was about exhuming a crime. We have to take this to the hearing, Marcus said, his voice firm. This isn't just hydrology. This is evidence of fraud and possibly worse. This changes everything. But as he spoke, a new sound pierced the twilight, not a truck, but the distant, two-tone wail of a sheriff's siren. It was coming closer fast. Keller, Marcus spat. He didn't wait for tomorrow. They scrambled. Alara shoved the crucial report and the cover letter into the leather tool belt pouch. Marcus grabbed a random stack of other, less critical maps and papers. They had to get the evidence out of the barn now. They burst out of the barn's side door just as 2 county sheriff's cruisers, lights flashing, skidded to a halt in Marcus's front yard. Brad Keller stepped out of the passenger side of the lead car, alongside a tall, weary-looking man in a sheriff's uniform. It was Sheriff Dale Ellis. Marcus and Alara froze, halfway between the barn and the cabin, caught in the open. "Marcus Thorne," Sheriff Ellis called out, his voice carrying the bored authority of a man doing a distasteful job. "I have a warrant here to search your barn and outbuildings for stolen county property." "Stolen what?" Marcus demanded, stepping forward, putting himself between the sheriff and Alara. "Surveying equipment. A high-grade GPS unit and a transit scope went missing from the county surveyor's office this afternoon. We have reason to believe they were brought here after the altercation with the legitimate survey team." It was a transparent, bald-faced frame-up. Keller stood slightly behind the sheriff, his face a mask of concerned citizenry. "That's ridiculous," Marcus said. "We've been in the barn going through old papers. You can look. There's no equipment." "That's what we aim to do," Ellis said, nodding to his 2 deputies who started toward the barn. "You and the woman just stay right there, please." Alara's hand went to her tool belt, feeling the hard outline of the report inside. If they searched her, they'd find it, and Keller would make sure it disappeared from evidence. Think the research on informal economies highlighted the strength of kith-and-kin networks in rural areas. Who here was kin? The sheriff. She searched his face. He looked tired, resigned, like a man who knew he was being used but saw no alternative. He wasn't kin, but maybe. As the deputies disappeared into the barn, she took a calculated risk. She addressed the sheriff directly, ignoring Keller. "Sheriff Ellis, my name is Elara Vance. My father was Robert Vance. He worked at the co-op for 22 years. He was injured on the job in 2003. You might remember the case." A flicker of recognition and something else, a hint of discomfort, passed over the sheriff's face. He did remember. Everyone in the county knew that story. "What's your point, ma'am?" he asked, his tone slightly less official. "My point is that Brad Keller and Consolidated Land and Water are about to commit a crime much bigger than a fake theft, and they're using you to do it. The equipment isn't in that barn, but the evidence of their fraud is, and if you let them take it, you become an accessory." Keller stepped forward, his mask of concern slipping into anger. "Sheriff, this is a desperate attempt to distract from." "Be quiet, Brad," Ellis said, not taking his eyes off Elara. The use of Keller's first name was telling. There was history there. "What evidence?" "The original co-op hydrology report from 2001. The one that proves the aquifer can't handle their planned withdrawal. The report my father wrote before he was silenced. Consolidated's current application is based on falsified data that directly contradicts it. That's fraud on a multi-million-dollar scale, and the man who ordered that fraud is standing right next to you." She was all in now, betting everything on the sheriff's latent sense of justice, or at least his fear of being on the wrong side of a major scandal. Ellis looked from her intense, dust-streaked face to Keller's suddenly pale one. The silence stretched. From inside the barn, a deputy called out, "Nothing in here, Sheriff. Just a lot of old papers." Keller recovered, his voice slick. "This is slander, Sheriff. This woman is a disgruntled former co-op employee with a grudge. Her father had a tragic accident. She's concocting a fantasy to help her friend Thorne here avoid a lawful land transaction." But the seed of doubt was planted. Ellis looked conflicted. The easy path was to dismiss her, complete the charade of the search, and leave. The hard path led into a political and legal minefield. Elara played her last card. She slowly, deliberately pulled the bound report from her tool belt. She didn't hand it over. She held it up so the sheriff could see the title page, her father's name. "This is the report, Sheriff. You can take it from me and give it to him," she nodded at Keller, "and be part of burying it again. Or you can take it as evidence of a crime and do your actual job, but you don't get to pretend you don't know anymore." It was a brutal, public forcing of a choice. The deputies had emerged from the barn and were watching. Marcus stood rigid, ready to intervene if Keller made a move. Sheriff Ellis stared at the report for what felt like an eternity. The twilight deepened, painting everyone in shades of blue and orange. Finally, he let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a man stepping off a fence. "Give it to me," he said to Elara. She handed it over. He took it, hefted its weight. Then he turned to Keller. "Brad, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions about this. And I'm impounding all of Consolidated's survey paperwork for the Thorne parcel until we can have an independent hydrologist review it." Keller's face contorted with fury. "Ellis, you idiot. Do you know what you're doing? This is bigger than you, bigger than this podunk county. My bosses will have your badge." "Maybe," Ellis said, his voice now edged with steel. "But tonight I still have it. Now you can come willingly, or I can arrest you for attempting to obstruct a law enforcement investigation. Your choice." The power dynamic in the yard inverted completely. The deputies, sensing the shift, moved to flank Keller. He was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outmotivated. He shot a look of pure venom at Elara and Marcus. "This isn't over." "It is for tonight," Sheriff Ellis said. "Get in the car." They led a sputtering, furious Brad Keller to a cruiser and drove away. The sudden quiet was deafening. Marcus and Alara stood alone in the yard as night fell in earnest. Alara's legs gave out. She sat down hard in the dust, trembling from head to toe. The emotional whiplash was too much. She had just accused a powerful corporation of maiming her father and potentially gotten a county sheriff to side with her. The scale of what she'd done was terrifying. Marcus sat down beside her, not speaking, just offering a solid presence. After a few minutes, he said, "You were magnificent." "I was terrified," she corrected, her voice shaky. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He paused. "He'll be out on bail by morning, and he'll have reinforcements from the corporate office. This just got a lot bigger. They'll send lawyers, PR people, maybe private security. The hearing in 7 days won't be a local zoning meeting anymore. It'll be a war." Alara knew he was right. By forcing the sheriff's hand, she had escalated the conflict to a level where Consolidated could no longer use quiet pressure. They would come with everything they had. The report was safe for now, but it was just one piece of paper against a machine with infinite resources. "We need more than the report," she said, the strategist in her re-emerging through the fatigue. "We need the chain of evidence. We need to prove they knew about my father's findings and deliberately suppressed them. We need the original co-op files, the internal memos, the settlement paperwork from my father's accident." "Those would be at the co-op's old headquarters, or in a storage unit somewhere," Marcus said. "But the co-op was dissolved. Its assets were sold off. Consolidated probably bought the paper trail along with everything else." "Then we need someone on the inside," Alara said, a dangerous idea forming. "You said they were always looking for competent people for documentation." Marcus stared at her aghast. "No, absolutely not. You are not walking into that lion's den. It's suicide. It's the only way to get the evidence we need to make this stick. A hearing with one contradictory report might delay them. A hearing with proof of a 20-year cover-up and corporate malfeasance could stop them permanently. They offered me a job today, remember. I could accept. It's a trap. They'll isolate you, discredit you, or worse. Maybe, but they'll also give me access, and I know their filing systems. I know how they hide things." She looked at him, her eyes fierce in the gathering dark. "This isn't just your land anymore, Marcus. It's my father's legacy. It's my name. I'm already in the war. I might as well fight it where I can do the most damage." Marcus saw the resolve in her face, the same stubborn dignity that had driven her to fix his fence. He couldn't stop her. He could only try to protect her. "If you do this," he said, his voice gravelly with emotion, "we need rules. A dead man's switch. You check in with me every day at a set time. If you miss it, I go straight to the sheriff with what we know. And we need a way to get documents out." They spent the next hour under the light of a single barn bulb, crafting a fragile, dangerous plan. Alara would go into Millerton tomorrow, find Keller, and accept the job offer. She would use her position to search for the documents linking Consolidated to the suppression of her father's report and the co-op's closure. Marcus would use the time to rally the other holdout ranchers in the valley, using the sheriff's temporary alignment as leverage. They would prepare for the hearing as if it were trial. It was a plan built on a knife's edge, dependent on Alara's ability to deceive powerful, dangerous people on their home turf. As they finalized it, a pair of headlights appeared on the county road, moving slowly. It wasn't a sheriff's cruiser. It was an unmarked black SUV. It didn't turn into the driveway. It just stopped on the road, idling, facing the ranch. A message. They were being watched. The battle lines were drawn, and the other side was already deploying its scouts. Marcus turned off the barn light, plunging them into darkness. "They're here," he whispered. Alara looked at the silent, ominous vehicle, a black silhouette against the starry sky. The cozy, reciprocal economy of the fence was a distant memory. She was now a soldier in a shadow war, about to infiltrate the enemy's camp. The price of her dignity had just become unimaginably high. The meal he'd made for her felt like a last supper. The fence she'd mended felt like the wall of a prison she was about to willingly enter. The SUV's engine revved once, a low growl in the night, and then it rolled away, disappearing into the dark. The waiting was over. The real fight began at dawn. Ilara Vance walked into the Millerton offices of Consolidated Land and Water at 8 a.m. the next morning, her father's tool belt replaced by a borrowed blouse, her posture not of defiance, but of calculated resignation. She was there to surrender, or so she needed them to believe. Brad Keller was waiting for her in a sterile, glass-walled conference room. He'd been released on his own recognizance before midnight. The system, as always, had worked quickly for him. He studied her as she sat down, his earlier fury now buried under a layer of professional assessment. "I underestimated you," he said, not as a compliment but as an analyst nodding a data point. "That was my mistake. I don't make it twice." "I don't want a war, Mr. Keller," Ilara said, keeping her voice flat, tired. The performance was her first crucial test. "I want a job. You said you were hearing, I need the work. And I think I've been on the wrong side of this." Keller leaned back, steepling his fingers. "The sheriff has my report. The hearing is in 6 days. You've already chosen a side." "The sheriff has one report, a 20-year-old document. I know how these things go. Your lawyers will tie it up in procedural knots for years. In the meantime, people need to eat. I need to eat." She met his gaze, letting a flicker of the desperation she'd genuinely felt for months show through. "I'm good with systems. I'm meticulous. You saw that. I can be an asset or I can be a problem you have to manage. I'd rather be an asset." It was the language he understood, cost-benefit risk management. He was silent for a long minute, evaluating. Finally, he nodded. "Document processing, archives. We're digitizing all the old county land records we've acquired. It's tedious work. You'll be supervised. You'll have no access to current projects. And you'll sign a comprehensive non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement." It was a cage, but it was the cage she needed to get into. "When do I start?" "Now." He led her to a windowless basement room, lined with filing cabinets and cardboard boxes. A single computer terminal sat on a desk. A security camera glowed red in the corner. Her supervisor was a taciturn older man named Walt, who grunted a greeting and pointed her to a stack of boxes marked Jasper Co-op, Asset Acquisition 2004. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They were giving her direct access to the very records she needed. It was either a trap of monumental arrogance or a test of her compliance. She decided it was both. For the next 4 days, Ilara became a model employee. She arrived early, left late, and processed documents with robotic efficiency. She digitized invoices, property deeds, and minutes from long-defunct county boards. She made no unusual requests. She took no documents from the room. She exchanged only necessary words with Walt. Every evening at exactly 6 p.m., she would call Marcus from a payphone outside the town's lone diner, using a prearranged code. The weather's holding meant she was safe and had found nothing. Looks like rain meant she was being watched closely. On the 3rd day, the code was partly cloudy. She had found the first thread. It was in a box of miscellaneous legal correspondence. A memo from Consolidated's in-house counsel, dated March 3, 2003, 3 months before her father's accident. The subject line: "Potential liability, JC Co-op Hydrologic Report Vance." The memo outlined concerns that Robert Vance's alarmist findings could jeopardize future development permits and suggested remedial actions to mitigate reputational and regulatory risk. It was not a smoking gun, but it was a direct link. It proved Consolidated knew about her father's report and saw it as a threat. She couldn't remove it. The camera watched, but she could memorize key phrases and document numbers. That evening, she relayed the information to Marcus. His voice was tense. On his end, the mobilization was meeting stiff resistance. 2 ranchers had agreed to stand with him. 3 others had refused, citing fear of reprisals. One had been visited by a new, more aggressive Consolidated representative who spoke less of money and more of consequences. "We need more than a memo," Marcus said. We need the action they took, the order. I'm looking, Alara whispered into the payphone, her eyes scanning the dark street. On the fifth day, the day before the hearing, she hit the wall. She processed every box in her assigned section. The records she needed, the internal work orders, the communications about her father's accident, the settlement details were not there. They were either destroyed or in a different location. She had the memo, and her father's report was with the sheriff, but it wasn't enough. Consolidated's lawyers would argue the memo was simply a routine risk assessment, and the old report was obsolete science. At 5 p.m., as she was preparing to leave, Walt surprised her. "Got a new transfer from Regional," he grumbled, wheeling in a hand truck with 3 sealed banker's boxes. "Last of the co-op stuff from off-site storage. Label says personnel terminations incidents. You can start on M tomorrow." Alara's blood went cold. Terminations incidents, this was it. The box was sealed with heavy tape. She looked at the camera, then at Walt. "I can stay late, get a head start." Walt shrugged. "Suit yourself. I'm locking up at 6. You'll need to sign out with the front security if you stay." He left. The clock read 5:15. She had 45 minutes in a building that was emptying out. This was her only chance. She worked with frantic precision. She sliced the tape with a letter opener, her hand steady. The first file she pulled was her own termination paperwork from the co-op. She set it aside. The second was a thick folder labeled Vance, Robert, Incident Report and Settlement. Inside was a nightmare. There were photographs of the silo marked as evidence. There were witness statements from 2 co-op employees she'd never heard of, describing her father as distracted and agitated in the weeks before the fall. And there was the settlement agreement, signed by her mother for a shockingly low sum, with a confidentiality clause. But at the very back, paper-clipped and unmarked, was a single typewritten page. It was an internal consolidated memo, not on letterhead, from a man named Arlen Cox, a name she recognized as a senior VP who had since retired. It was addressed to Project Head, Jasper Valley. The date was 1 week before her father's accident. The memo read, "The Vance problem requires a permanent solution. The co-op board is compliant. Ensure the incident is clean and the family is settled quietly. The hydrology issue dies with his credibility." Alara stopped breathing. This was it. The order. The proof that her father's accident was not an accident but a corporate decision to eliminate a threat. It was a confession. She heard the distant sound of the main office door closing. Walt was leaving. She had minutes. She couldn't take the whole file, the camera, but she could take the 1 page. She folded it into a tiny square, slipped it into her shoe, and quickly resealed the box with a fresh strip of tape she'd pocketed earlier. She logged off the computer, gathered her things, and walked out of the room, her gait slightly uneven from the paper in her shoe. The security guard at the front desk barely looked up as she signed out. She stepped into the cool evening air, and the magnitude of what she carried threatened to buckle her knees. She didn't call Marcus. She walked straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Ellis was at his desk. He listened in grim silence as she told him what she'd found, then handed him the folded memo. He read it, his face turning ashen. "My God," he murmured, This is conspiracy to commit murder." "It's evidence," Alara corrected, her voice trembling. "For tomorrow's hearing, will you enter it into the record?" Ellis looked at her, then at the memo. The weight of his office and his own past complicity in looking the other way settled on him. "It's my duty," he said finally. The day of the hearing dawned bright and harsh. The county courthouse meeting room was packed. Marcus was there with the 2 holdout ranchers. Brad Keller sat at a table with 3 lawyers in expensive suits. The 5-member planning commission looked bored and impatient. The air was thick with tension. The hearing proceeded as a dry recitation of permits and regulations until Sheriff Ellis asked to be recognized. He walked to the front, holding a document envelope. He placed the original hydrology report and the newly discovered memo on the clerk's desk. Madam Chair, I am submitting into evidence two documents that bear directly on the credibility of the applicant's environmental claims and which indicate possible criminal activity that falls under my jurisdiction. The room erupted. Keller shot to his feet, objecting. The commission chair pounded her gavel. The lawyers converged, but the evidence was entered. Ilara, sitting in the back row, watched as the commission members read the memo, their expressions shifting from boredom to shock to anger. The hearing devolved from a zoning matter into something else entirely. Keller and his lawyers stonewalled, demanding adjournment, questioning the authenticity of the memo. But the damage was done. The commission chair, a retired schoolteacher, fixed Keller with a steely gaze. Mr. Keller, this commission's mandate is to evaluate the public good. This memo suggests your company's approach to the public good has historically been to remove obstacles by any means necessary. We cannot, in good conscience, grant a permit to an entity with such a demonstrated contempt for due process and human safety. The permit was denied, unanimously. The victory in the room was quiet, stunned. There were no cheers. There was only the profound relief of a bullet dodged. But as the room emptied, Keller approached Ilara, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have no idea what you've started," he hissed. "This is a setback, not a defeat. We have other avenues, and you've made yourself a permanent enemy." "I was already your enemy," Ilara said quietly. "You just didn't know it." In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift but messy. The district attorney opened an investigation into the memo and the death of Robert Vance. Consolidated Land and Water, facing a potential murder-for-hire scandal, swiftly settled with the Vance family for an undisclosed but life-changing sum, while publicly distancing itself from the alleged actions of a single, rogue, retired executive. Brad Keller was transferred out of state. The easement on Marcus's land was abandoned. Marcus's immediate crisis was over. The bank, sensing the shift in the wind and the new notoriety of his stand, offered a restructuring of his loan. The other holdout ranchers, emboldened, formed a coalition to jointly defend their water rights. And Ilara, she had her justice and her family's financial security restored, but she found she couldn't go back to Cedar Fork, to the quiet life she'd imagined. The research on dignity had proven true in an unexpected way. The act of sustained, righteous struggle had not just preserved her self-worth, it had redefined it. She was no longer just someone who could mend a fence. She was someone who could help mend a broken system. Marcus found her one evening, sitting on the porch of the cabin, looking at the now famous fence line. "What now?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "That memo mentioned a compliant co-op board, my old manager, others, they let it happen. They traded my father's life for their own security." She looked at him. "The co-op may be gone, but that kind of betrayal, it's a rot. It's in other towns with other companies. I can't unknow what I know how to do." Marcus nodded, understanding. He gestured to the yard, the barn, the land. "I could use a partner, not just for the fights, for the rebuilding. The formal economy failed us both, but we're pretty good at the informal one." It was the final, surprising pivot. The reciprocal exchange that began with a fence repair had evolved into a partnership. Not a romance, but a deep, respectful alliance built on shared risk and proven trust. Ilara moved into the cabin's spare room. She used part of her settlement to buy a minority stake in the ranch. Together, they began the long work of restoring the land, using her father's original, conservative hydrology report as their guide. The fence she'd mended that first day still stood. It was no longer just a boundary. It was a monument to a simple, powerful truth uncovered by the research, that when the formal systems fail, the human impulses for dignity and reciprocity don't die. They become the foundation for everything that comes next. They become the new economy. And sometimes that new economy starts with a single, silent act of repair, witnessed through a window and answered with a meal set for two. The story of the fence was over. The story of what they built because of it was just beginning. The story of the fence is, in its quietest truth, a map. It charts the distance between what we are told we are worth by failing systems and what we prove we are worth through our own hands and our willingness to see that same worth in others. Ilara Vance and Marcus Thorne's partnership did not magically reverse the drought or solve rural poverty, but it did something more fundamental. It validated the research. It proved that the informal economy is not a shadow of the real one, but often its moral and practical backbone. That 38.2% of rural households aren't just surviving on the margins. They are engaging in a complex, dignified barter of skill and need that formal markets have abandoned. And when that dignity is recognized, rather than managed, it can become the most potent force for change there is. Their ranch became a hub. Other farmers came, not just to discuss water rights, but to revive old practices of work sharing and reciprocal aid. They used Ilara's father's true hydrology report to petition for sustainable, community-managed water conservation districts. The fight moved from defense to construction. The deeper lesson here is about the architecture of power. Consolidated land and water operated on a simple principle: isolate, pressure, and acquire. They understood formal systems, deeds, permits, courts, but they failed to understand the informal one, the network of respect, the economy of mutual obligation, the unbreakable will of someone who has chosen to stand their ground not for profit, but for principle. They mistook silence for compliance, and they mistook a mended fence for a simple repair, not recognizing it as the first stitch in a stronger social fabric they could not tear. Ilara's journey from economic displacement to restitution wasn't a fairy tale. The settlement money brought security, not peace. That came from the work, from continuing to mend what was broken, both in the land and in the legacy of her father. Marcus found his purpose shifted from merely holding on to building something that could hold others. So what does this mean for the rest of us, watching from outside the frame of that cabin window? It means that the next time you see someone engaged in silent, determined labor, someone fixing, building, cleaning, creating value outside the official ledger, look closer. You might be witnessing the first move in a much larger game. You might be seeing the reassertion of a basic human truth, that we are not just consumers or liabilities. We are potential partners in reciprocity. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act is not a demand, but an offer to repair, to contribute, to prove one's worth on terms that no corporation can devalue and no drought can wither. Their story is a specific one, set under a Kansas sun, but the pattern is universal. It repeats wherever people are pushed to the edge and decide that their dignity is the one thing they will not negotiate. It's happening right now, in your county, on your street, in the quiet spaces where formal solutions have failed. The question this documentary leaves you with is not what you would do if you were them. The question is, what unrecognized value exists right outside your own window, and what might happen if you simply chose to see it and honor it? If stories of resilience, of quiet courage rewriting unjust rules, matter to you, then your engagement fuels this channel. Hit that subscribe button right now. Become part of a community that seeks out these maps of human dignity. Because the next story is already unfolding, waiting for someone to connect the dots, and I'll be here to bring it to you.